Welcome to this guest lecture recording by John Berry from Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. He will be talking about planning in the 21st century beyond growth, carbon and capitalism. My name is Christian Lamker, and this guest lecture has been part of the course City Matters, Urban Inequality and Social Justice at the University of Groningen, Faculty of Spatial Sciences. The recording is of 8th October 2024. Now have fun, enjoy, and take many critical thoughts with you.
Go raibh míle maith agat Christian, agus díobh go léir ó Éireann is as spéil firsta tá ansásta agam a bheith an seo. So a couple of words in my native language, Irish, that says, greetings from Ireland. I'm very happy to be here and thank you, Christian, for the opportunity. As Christian said, I'll introduce myself briefly before I give my presentation. I'm an unusual academic in that I'm a recovering politician. I'm a former leader of the Green Party here in the north of Ireland and also a local municipal councillor where I was for 7 years in my local area. I'm very much an activist, whether it's against the genocide in Gaza, hence the Palestinian flag behind me, Extinction Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion, and a lot of activism of mine is currently around changing the university or higher education system to be more democratic, to include the voices and concerns of our students, because I feel very strongly that our students across the university system are not being prepared for the world that's now emerging into being. And part of what I'm going to offer you today, and again, I speak not as a planner, I'm a heterodox post-growth green political economist, looking at the science and the evidence that our current economic system that's based on carbon, based on capitalism, and based on economic growth is now suboptimal, risky, and needs to radically reform. And my invitation to you as planners is to fundamentally be skeptical, if not outright reject, the dominant economic framing or the dominant economic knowledge that informs planning, which is essentially a form of neoclassical economics, which is very pro-market, pro-globalization, pro-capitalist. Of course, you can disagree, and that's fine. And that's what I'm going to be presenting. So again, I'm not speaking as a planner. I'm speaking as a recovering politician, politically active academic, and also somebody who is concerned about the well-being of future generations because of the lack of government action, including in the way in which our spatial and urban planning system is constructed. So here's a nice, interesting dinner party or pub question, and I'll ask you this in the time that we have. In the room that you're in now, can you answer this question? And again, it's a kind of partly a trick question. If somebody has an answer, please offer it in the discussion. But it's very hard to think of something that isn't made in whole or part or transported in whole or part without the use of carbon, coal, oil, or gas, which of course is the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So what I'm proposing for you to think about is not only is our current economic model based on carbon, it's suboptimal and dangerous, but we also have an awful lot in the policy community, in academia, in the media, even within the planning discussions I have with colleagues here in Belfast. There's a lot of what I would call mythic thinking, wishful thinking about green growth, that we can find a technological way of decoupling all the negative impacts of a growing capitalist, globalized economy from resources, from pollution, including the climate. But the reality is we have very little empirical evidence, even though we would like this to be the case. I mean, I would like to look like Brad Pitt, but that's not going to be the case. That's wishful thinking. And I would say that the wishful thinking that dominates our policy discussion around how do we address the climate and ecological crisis is largely about this technological, ecological modernization, green capitalism, green growth, and so on. Even the circular economy, I think, falls within this category of greening business as usual. So in other words, we keep the capitalist growth-based economic system going. We're just going to decouple the energy, the materials, the negative ecological and pollution impacts. Whereas what I would propose is, why not decouple human well-being, human flourishing, jobs, healthcare, food, good air? Why don't we decouple those good things we need from a capitalist growth-based carbon economy? And that's why my view is that we need to start seriously considering non-technological ways of dealing with the crisis that we face, and remembering that there are multiple benefits in moving beyond carbon, moving beyond growth, and indeed moving beyond capitalism. That we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are many benefits. It's not just the urgency and the crisis, but actually there's lots of benefits in our societies. Make them less unequal, have cleaner air, we'd be healthier, life would be slower, it would be good, it'd be different. There's no doubt about it, it'd be different, but it's not going to be a disaster if we move beyond growth, capitalism, and carbon, is the point that I'm making. And in particular, the comments I'm proposing are really at a large scale level, the macro level of the economy. So as a post-growth economist, I feel really strongly you need to understand that a non-growing economy does not mean every sector of the economy has to decline. Some sectors can grow, so we increase renewable energy. Some sectors decline, maybe red meat production. But so long as the overall economy is not transgressing biophysical, science-based planetary boundaries, bits of the economy can grow and bits can contract. That's the idea of the just transition within an economy. So again, do not think that when I talk about post-growth, I mean every sector of the economy has to contract and decline. So here's the reality that we're facing, particularly for you as planners in training, is that in my view, and again, I speak as somebody from outside planning, but I have written with planners, I teach on planning courses here in my university and so on, is that planning is largely in the service of GDP economic growth or competitiveness, global, excellence, foreign direct investment. This is why we're changing our landscapes and urbanscapes and so on. But I would say that there are other, objectives for planning. And in fact, if I had more time with you, and I don't know whether this has been part of your training, but historically speaking, planning is a public health movement. That's where it begins from, particularly in the urbanizing, industrializing cities of Europe in the 19th century. So why can't planning return to that public health objective? Or indeed to question orthodox economic growth, that it's unsustainable. If you think about it, the human economy is a subsystem of the larger Earth system. The Earth system isn't growing. Last time I looked, the planet isn't growing. So how can a subsystem continually grow in a non-growing system? I won't have time probably to go into these other points below that, which is that an economic growth-based model of the economy, particularly on the capitalism, it manages inequalities. So if you're an egalitarian, you want a less unequal society, growth may not be the policy that you choose. And indeed, we have a lot of evidence that after a threshold, economic growth does not add to human flourishing. And in fact, you could say our economies in Europe, we're growed up. We have enough wealth and resources in our societies. The problem is we need to redistribute it. We have too few people with too much wealth and resources, and we have a lot of people who need more resources. So why is growth the solution to meeting the needs of those and not redistribution? So therein lies an ideological trick of growth. Growth is a way of deflecting from redistribution. You say we don't need redistribution, we just need to grow the economy and everybody benefits. You've probably heard phrases like a rising tide lifts all boats and so on. But the idea I'm proposing to you is that that's biophysically a very risky thing to do, and particularly from a planning point of view. But this is a statement actually by one of the early founders of ecological economics, a science-based view of economics. So not neoclassical economics, which is largely a fictitious world of how the economy operates. You can read it there yourself. But the issue I really want to reassure you is the last point I make here, is that it's not criticizing planning per se, but it's planning that uncritically accepts this neoclassical capitalist growth-based model, that's what planning should be in service of. So why can't planning be in service of making the world less unequal, improving human well-being, improving human health? And why does it always have to be orientated towards economic growth objectives, for example? And I give you a current case on the left-hand side there. This is the recent UK government under Labour with Keir Starmer. And it's an example of this techno wish fulfillment. So the British government has just announced £22 billion of investment in carbon capture. But as my colleagues, this is a tweet I've taken from one of my colleagues in England, Charlie Gardner. And you can read it there yourself. Carbon capture is like a mop that's trying to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. But we already know that we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. So it's like a bath overrunning. So why not turn off the tap? Why are we investing 22 billion, very large sum of money in this technological fix? That means we can burn coal, oil and gas, and then we'll suck it out of the air and stick it in the ground. Well, why not reduce the burning of the coal, oil and gas in the first place? And that's why I give you on the right-hand side a piece of work, which I'd encourage you all to read. It's very accessibly written. It's by the European Environment Bureau from 2019. And it basically goes through the arguments as to why these techno fixes are very risky. This idea of decoupling is actually mythic. We have no strong empirical basis that we can do what these techno fixes like carbon capture and so on can do. So this is, if you like, not just a normative or ideological argument, make the world less unequal or improve human flourishing. It is a science-based argument. It's an empirical argument. We do not have any evidence that we can decouple a growing capitalist economy from resource use. And yet this is what our political leaders are planning on doing. So this is the problem, just to state it very simply, is this idea. So I'm not anti-growth. Growth is good up to a point, but why should growth be a permanent feature of the economy? Why did the economy have to continually grow? If you're in a very poor state, obviously growth and wealth production, more resources is good. But why does it have to be the continual permanent objective of the economy? But the reality is, for most of you in the room listening to me, you've probably got some vague commitment to growth. Growth is good because in the media, growth is down. This has a bad impact on people's lives. But the reality is, for most people, I suspect, and there is some social science evidence for this, when they hear growth, it's not GDP and so on that they're concerned about. It's jobs, it's healthcare, it's services. So what if we can have jobs, healthcare, and services, the things we want, but without growth? That's the point. Growth is a means to an end, as opposed to an end in itself. And once it's done its job, why don't we move on to something beyond economic growth as an objective, including the role of planning in that? So the reality is, just to repeat, growth is biophysically impossible. It's actually making our societies more unequal. Our societies are more unequal today than they were at any time since the post-war period. That, again, is only of interest to you if you're concerned about inequality. And actually, growth is no longer adding to human flourishing after a point, certainly in the global north, the minority world. So it's important to recognize that my argument here is firmly directed towards those of us who live in the minority world, the rich world, the former imperialist colonizing world of North America, Europe, Australasia, and Japan. And I don't know if anyone in the room has ever formally studied economics, but certainly the economics that informs planning, including the teaching, but also in the practice of planning, is neoclassical economics. And sadly, if you were ever taught economics, you have been ideologically indoctrinated. And this is a campaign that students began a few years ago in terms of calling out the non-real, mythical, fictional kind of model of the economy that you get in neoclassical economics. You can see it there that the modern economics as it's taught in universities and schools, and actually it's what operates most government thinking, it's not ecologically informed. It's not science-based informed. It's based upon these ideas of supply and demand, of ISLM curves, and equilibrium between supply and demand resulting in the price and so on. And what we need is an economics that's down to earth, that's embedded in the biophysical realities of living on this planet. And the reason why I say that is that from a science-based point of view, and this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that you may have come across before in some of the classes with Christian or others. It's the world's top body informing governments around what's going on with the climate system and climate science. And a report from 2 years ago, you can read it there yourself. This is what is it concluded. The urgency. The more we delay decarbonization and moving to a more regenerative, economy, including, I would say, a post-growth economy, we are missing this opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. But sadly, we're up against the capitalist system. That actually there is money to be made in death. There's money to be made in fossil fuels. In fact, because to go back to that earlier slide I have, most of our civilization, our food system, transportation, energy, and so on, are all based upon oil and to a lesser extent gas and coal. These are very profitable commodities. To put it very provocatively, coal, oil, and gas are like the heroin of our societies. We are addicted to them. That would explain why Europe was in a panic in the war in Ukraine and the cutting off of Russian gas. Why America led a European invasion and occupation, which was illegal in Iraq in 2003, just over 20 years ago, because of the oil that was available in Iraq. So to use that analogy, in the same way a drug addict will engage in violence to get their fix, we already have evidence of the ways in which our leaders in Europe and North America, they will also engage in violence to get our fix because our societies are so dependent upon them. And it also is so profitable. It's not a very comfortable thought, but neither is the next thought that actually, technically speaking, a growth-based system for its own sake, that's cancer. That's what cancer is. It's the point beyond which a cell has passed being healthy for the organism. And so I would say that again, in the minority world where most of us live, in Europe and North America in particular, we are now in cancerous growth, or actually we are now in uneconomic growth. That growth is causing more problems than actually providing benefits. And we have the evidence for this from a scientific point of view, which then asks the question, in whose interest is it to have this continuing growth-based system? But what is growth? So growth is the expenditure from a technical point of view of money on goods and services in a given year in a particular country, the Netherlands, Ireland, and so on. So the top line are some of the things that are good. These things add to GDP, goods and services like beer, bicycles, education. I wouldn't recommend doing the first two by themselves from personal experience when I was younger. But what also adds to GDP? Things like divorce. You say, why? Well, suddenly you need maybe 2 apartments or 2 houses. Maybe the child, if you have children, needs 2 sets of toys. All of this is ching, 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 ching. The economy is growing. Even environmental pollution causes some level of growth, particularly for those in litigation and the legal contestation in courts. And sadly, war is good for the economy. We can see this whenever we have a war, as we currently have the genocide in Gaza or the ongoing war in Ukraine, sectors of our economy, particularly the military and the production of weapons, that increases. And if you have an economy like America, where up to, perhaps depending on how you measure it, 20% of the US economy is part of what's known as the military industrial complex, employing hundreds of thousands of people, investments in capital and so on. Well, wars are good for that sector of the economy. But then what is missing from GDP? Well, the unpaid work of mostly women in our homes, the care labor that goes on in our homes, no money changes hands. That's not included in GDP. If you volunteer in your local community, if you're a member of a community garden where you're not exchanging money, that doesn't get included in GDP. And the last thing is, we all live in democracies, and most of us, like that fact and we value it. Yet the work that goes into maintaining our democracies is not often included in GDP. So what I'm saying is GDP is not measuring what matters. not measuring what matters. We need a different measurement of the objective for whether or not our economies are doing well and whether or not we're progressing as a society. But for you as planners, these are the questions I would ask you to consider. They're almost like childlike questions, but we should always celebrate and always, see the value of these childlike questions. Asking, is this a stupid question? Well, there's never a stupid question. Maybe stupid answers, but there's never a stupid question. Why do we need economic growth? Why don't we have this question asked more widely? To have citizens or yourselves as planners wondering, what is this growth? Why do we need it? Can we not find other ways of getting the things we want without using economic growth as the means? And in particular, can we have good lives, live in good, healthy cities with clean water, lots of blue and green spaces? Do we need growth for that? Are there other ways we can meet these essential human needs and desires without being based upon economic growth? Because just to summarize, our current capitalist system, which I propose that planning at the moment is very much in service of, is, I call it here, a regime of growth or capital accumulation. It's all about profit making. It's all about the economy growing. And essentially, the capitalist economy is like a bicycle. It either goes and grows or it collapses. It has no, from a systems point of view, homeostatic. There's no steady state. And that's where we need to get to, because nothing grows forever. No living entity grows forever. You grow as a human being, as a child, you reach maturation, and you don't grow after that. Well, your tummy does if you're a middle-aged man like me, but in height you don't. So the idea here is that why aren't we mimicking natural systems of homeostasis, that our economy grows, we go through our teenage years as the economy, we're a bit rebellious and so on, then we reach maturity and then we stop growing. We move from the quantity of growth into quality. That's the issue. Growth is replaced then by quality and development, and not by producing more stuff and so on. And a question then that I always ask, particularly young people like yourselves, and I imagine this might be true for you, that for a lot of young people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Whether it's in popular films like The Day After Tomorrow, Don't Look Up. Have you ever noticed how most of our popular cultural films about the future are always negative? But why can't we see that capitalism is only a particular organization of the economy. We can change it. It isn't somehow like the weather or indeed like the climate system that we often have little control over, that actually we can control how the economy is structured. So again, just to reiterate, it's not an anti-growth position that I'm proposing to you as planners. It's not that growth is rejected, but it's this idea beyond a threshold, it creates more problems than it produces benefits. At that point, then, as I mentioned before, it becomes uneconomic growth. So it's endless growth as a permanent feature that's the issue. And similarly with capitalism, we could say capitalism has produced a lot of good things in our society. But why do we have to continue with this system when we can see now it's causing problems? So the issue here is about sequentially a developmental model of human society. Now, why should we stick to growth, to carbon, to capitalism, when we have other alternatives in order to meet our fundamental needs and desires? And this analysis, as I said, is for the macro level of the economy, although you can disaggregate it down perhaps to city levels as well. As you know, as an example, you can look at the application of Kate Raworth's donut model to Amsterdam, for example, in terms of taking this kind of, post-growth position of not transgressing planetary boundaries, but making sure the social floor of meeting people's needs are also met. And again, the argument here is only for the minority world, and the issue is to stay within planetary boundaries. And this model that I mentioned already, that's been applied, as far as I know, to Amsterdam, you may have seen this before, is the planetary boundaries model, the ecological ceiling, that's been determined by science, and the social foundation, that's more of a social science, looking at how do we meet human needs. So in other words, this is the donut, a ring donut. Planning should be within that green space. At the moment, I think it's more pushing beyond our ecological ceiling, and often it's not meeting the needs of our citizens. So it's both overshooting and undershooting, as it were, in terms of meeting needs. And that, again, is because I think planning has uncritically drunk the Kool-Aid of neoclassical capitalist economic growth. And it's not just me in terms of the kind of strange academic that I am, activist and so on. The science is now coming around, at least a minority of scientists in this latest report by the IPCC, suggesting we need to move to a degrowth, post-growth economy, or at least a non-growth. In other words, to detach the development of our society. If we want to reach these targets of keeping global average temperatures to 1.5, or in this case, 2, we need to move beyond economic growth. And again, another example of the science behind this. This is a letter written by you can read it there, nearly 12,000 scientists from around the world in 53 countries. And what they suggested in this letter in Bioscience in 2020, you can see it there, we need to move beyond, GDP. So in other words, what I'm offering you is the empirical science-based argument, and not just, if you like, normative ones of inequality or human flourishing. And in the UK context, this is a report that came out 2 years ago, there is in 2022, the second point, GDP was not set up to measure human well-being or societal progress. So the issue here is, why are we still continuing with an outmoded 20th century metric and objective for our economies? And this is a rather kind of funny way, but it's a kind of provocative again to get you to start thinking, oh my God, is that what GDP is? So read this and you'll see every step of this horror story adds to GDP. In other words, GDP is indifferent normatively in terms of human health. It doesn't care. All it cares about, has money exchanged hands, has profits been made, has a good or service been sold. That's all it counts. It's amoral in some respects. It pretends to be apolitical as well, but actually is pro the capitalist system. What we need to do is question this. So therefore, just to summarize, we have scientific reasons to decouple, carbon certainly and growth from, what a sustainable economy looks like. And in particular, if you're a planner and you're concerned about decarbonization and reaching net zero, there is no credible pathway based upon technologically decoupling a capitalist growth-based economy. We need to change the structure of our economy beyond growth, carbon, and capitalism. And that means we need a different type of planning. And that's the question for you to think about. What does planning look like in the 21st century? Maybe it's orientated a bit like the public health origins of planning about human flourishing. It's certainly based upon moving away from a carbon-based energy system. But what does a post-capitalist planning system actually look like? And again, I would say returning to the public purpose. In other words, planning is not simply there to de-risk or to help things happen for the market. It should also be about serving our communities. And particularly the last point that many of you be familiar with, the creation and maintenance of space, of turning space into place, of creating livable cities and urban areas where people can get the goods and services they need, lead high quality lives without wrecking the planet. I mean, that should be the design challenge for planning in the 21st century. How can we have high quality of lives in urban areas without wrecking the planet and causing climate and ecological devastation? And then my final slide is just to kind of sum up this. And the bit to really highlight is the bit I have in bold, is that, again, it's not an anti-growth argument. It's that we in Europe, certainly, we are grown up. We are a mature society. We have arrived in terms of overcoming many of the challenges our grandparents and great-grandparents face in terms of poverty, healthcare, and so on. Those challenges still are there. But what we need is not growth. We have enough resources in our society. The problem is that they're not going to the people that need it. And answer yourself this question: why is it that Western governments have found the money to send Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine to fight the war in Russia, or indeed the Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is in receipt of billions of certainly US dollars and also millions in UK money. So the issue is not the money. Why, if we can spend money on war, why can't we spend money now on the things that we actually need in society? And we could do that. The idea is here without growth, without carbon, but also then we have to give capitalism a good Irish wake. We should bury capitalism, thank it for its services, and move on to a different economic system. So I leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you.